Welcome to episode 11 of Sunaparanta's talk show series, Listen In. This evening, it is our pleasure to introduce Thaddeus Doard, art historian and assistant professor at Northwestern University. Thaddeus, welcome to Sunaparanta. Thank you for being here, and we are looking forward to hearing your voice. Our session today is titled Disfiguring or Refiguring, the Past and Futures of Public Statues. It starts off from the recent spate of events where we have been seeing activists across the West tearing down public monuments that once memorialized different forms of racial violence. Our conversation today will try to understand the relevance of such acts of public dissent for art historians, how the tearing down of objects is actually part of a creative process, and the many ways in which destruction has always been part of the history of art. We will also be addressing how these actions are the first step in challenging and rethinking about the role of public art and the function of public space. The session will begin with the broad overview where we will be trying to contextualize this present moment. We follow this by highlighting what are the different ways in which we intervene into the lives of objects, with examples from historic and contemporary forms of iconoclasm. Iconoclasm refers to the destruction of images. We will then also examine how these instances of public expression challenge power relations. We also address what could be an alternative life for these monuments, and we finally end our discussion by looking at the challenges of contemporary artworks in public space. Thaddeus, over these past weeks, we have seen monuments of historic figures being brought down. Monuments that are known for their roles in preserving slavery or racial violence being torn down. Places overnight are turning into sites of protest and destruction. How can we understand this present moment?
Thank you, Leandre, and thank you to Sunaparanta for the invitation to speak with you today. So this moment is a big one, and it's hard to summarize briefly. But what we're seeing here is across cities in the United States and in Europe as well, in Virginia, in Boston, all the way to Bristol in England and Antwerp in Belgium. We're seeing statues primarily of historical figures who are involved in one way or another in historical events that are associated with genocide, racial violence, or slavery, being the targets of protest and different kinds, from defacement to creative and somewhat cheeky refigurations, to sites of performance, from music to ballet. It's hard to summarize them all, but what they all have in common is an understanding that the values that these monuments espouse and the way that these monuments function in defining the public spaces that they inhabit are no longer tenable for a large number of people, particularly people of color. In the United States, this includes Indigenous American populations as well. So part of this issue is, of course, a question of history. It's how we interpret the meaning and importance of these figures. So one figure, for example, that has been the target of, whose statues have been the target of a lot of these protests is someone like Christopher Columbus, a figure who, over the last 100 years of scholarship, we've reached a new consensus over his role in, let's say, the history of the Americas, where perhaps the celebratory position he once held is no longer the way that we think about history. And so there is a kind of disconnect between these monuments and the importance that they had in the past versus the importance and meaning that they have now. It should also be said that a lot of these monuments have been many people, particularly people of color and people whose voices are not typically heard, have been calling for the removal of these monuments for a long time, long before the recent killings of George Floyd in Minneapolis or Breonna Taylor. That this is not something that's necessarily new, but that these protests are using the momentum of the moment and the political will that these events have generated in order to rethink these monuments and rethink public space. And as these ideas have spread to Europe, groups that are not necessarily dealing with the same issues that American groups are, but see a connection, a philosophical connection, a moral connection, are similarly taking up these kinds of protests. And so I think that forms a sort of broad overview of sort of what we're seeing. And our own conversation today, however, is going to really try to focus on this from an art historical perspective. Some of these issues are historical problems, to be sure, and that requires a separate conversation. But because the status of these objects as art has been presented by liberals and conservatives alike as a reason for basically delegitimizing these protests and slandering those involved as vandals or as just opportunists, I think it's really important for those of us who study art and its history to intervene and to share our perspective on why the art status of these objects should not necessarily stop us from understanding the goals and the moral drive of these groups.
Yes, but I mean, we know that these cultural artifacts remind us of exploitations of certain groups in Western societies, but how do we legitimize public acts of dissent? How do we legitimize we don't call it vandalism, but how can we consent to these public actions of tearing down objects in our public spaces?
And it's a great question, and I think the simple answer would be to do very good art history with these objects. So if we're going to focus particularly on the Confederate monuments, these are monuments that are dedicated to heroes of the Confederacy, people like Robert E. Lee, the great Confederate general. These particular statues, and these are the ones that have been the primary targets of protests and the site of this defacement and creative reappropriation, is these statues were put up during the Jim Crow era of the United States. Jim Crow being this period in which the economic and political gains of freed slaves in the period after the Civil War were trying to be actively suppressed by white people throughout the South. And one of the ways in which they did this is happening from the 1890s all the way until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, was to use statues to intimidate Black populations, to use them to carve out urban space as being a white space, and thus they contributed very intentionally to segregation. So it's important that these objects, maybe from our perspective, certainly from a white American perspective, and perhaps also from an international perspective, it might not be clear, what these objects were intended to do, that they had a kind of violence in them, and that they were designed to reimagine the history of slavery and of the Civil War, not as an issue of slavery and of the owning of Black bodies, but as fundamentally an issue of states' rights, which is a complete, it's not just an erasure, it's a manipulation of actual history. So to go back to your question is, so how do we legitimize public acts of dissent? Well, it's important to understand the origins of these monuments. And I think when the histories of these monuments become clear, and there has been scholarly consensus on this for decades, I think suddenly we realize that these monuments, these are not the kinds of monuments that should still be, occupying important public spaces in a desegregated society.
Okay. When we were speaking over discussions in the past weeks, you called these gestures of countercultural activity, we can call that these actions, that you call them acts of iconoclasm. Are there different typologies of iconoclasm?
Certainly. Iconoclasm refers generally to the destruction of artworks, primarily figural artworks, but not just that. And there certainly are a continuum. So, the image that we're seeing here of the statue of Saddam Hussein coming down in Sherdor Square in Baghdad, I think it's very easy for people to be sympathetic with this kind of iconoclasm, right? Because of the political context around it. But there are other unsympathetic forms of iconoclasm that exist as well. But it's important to understand that, and the reason why I think iconoclasm is such an important term here is because it's a unifying art historical kind of event. And the way that iconoclasm is thought about by art historians is not simply as an act of destruction. Iconoclasms come in all different sizes and iterations, and some of them are often designed intentionally to actually be a kind of recontextualization or a kind of performance. So if we take the specific case of the Bamiyan statues in Afghanistan, which were, let's say, destroyed by the Taliban in 2001, this is a very unsympathetic form of iconoclasm, right? This was decried by all international organizations as a senseless act of violence. And my goal in talking about this is not to somehow morally redeem what happened. As an art historian, my job is less to sort of cast moral judgment on these things and try to just sort of understand how they work. So in the particular case of the Bamiyan statue, this was a very calculated performance. The statue, after it was removed, the Taliban invited the international press to come and see the vacancy, right? The emptiness as itself as a kind of anti-monument, right? As a way for the Taliban to make a kind of critique. And what they were critiquing primarily was what they would call a kind of cultural fetishism. What they saw as this being a UNESCO site that is sort of appreciated as part of a global and trans-historical culture. What the Taliban were doing here was pointing out a kind of moral dubiousness about the international community. A Taliban representative said, in response to the former director of the Met, who was willing to buy a lot of the statues that were destroyed in Afghanistan, et cetera, that they were saying, well, the international community is perfectly interested in spending money to loot objects out of Central Asia, but are completely unwilling to give any money to Afghani men, women, and children who are dying of famine. And Afghanistan at this point was was going through a famine because of sanctions against the country that was imposed by the international community. So even when we take a very unsympathetic case, right, like the Bamiyans, and talk about it within the frame of iconoclasm, we begin to see that to describe this as senseless destruction is to miss the nuances here, and to appreciate that destruction, and Palmyra under ISIS is another example. In Palmyra, there were no figurative sculptures. All of those have been moved to museums. This is not just an Islamic opposition to figural imagery. It was a way for these organizations who are opposed to Western-led international orders to use destruction as a creative force to draw attention to their own critiques and their own sort of the way in which culture can sometimes be put above the lives of actual people. So iconoclasm, I think, is very effective in that sense in bringing out all of the nuances and they're difficult moral issues for sure, but it helps us to get away from just destruction, that this is meaningless and senseless. Artworks are meaningful, they are powerful, and calculated and strategic performative actions of trying to do a kind of iconoclasm are themselves a creative gesture meant to produce meaning. And art historians, because we're fundamentally interested in historical and cultural expressions that are meaningful, acts of destruction are just as interesting to us as a cultural expression as the monuments themselves. And I think that is an issue that has by and large been left out of the conversation thus far.
Would you say that these acts of iconoclasm or acts of intervention, if you want to use a softer term, that they invigorate these objects or ancient sites?
With meaning, with new meaning, absolutely. I don't think most people in the Western world knew what Palmyra was until ISIS went in there. Absolutely. And it's an opportunity for, whether we're talking about very unsympathetic organizations like the Taliban or ISIS, or we're talking about, the movements that we'll talk about later. And I don't want to put these two as if they're somehow comparable, but I think iconoclasm becomes a way of framing all of these kinds of events as being precisely an attempt to take over and reorient the meaning of art objects. Not to just negate them completely, not to simply wipe them off the face of the planet, but using forms of iconoclasm to generate new meaning and to take control of that meaning.
So you're saying that we are constantly intervening into the lives of objects, whether it is a monument of a historic figure or objects in our everyday lives that constantly change its context and meaning?
Absolutely. I mean, these kinds of interventions are obviously very drastic, and I know that there's most of us, believe that there's a kind of historical value to these monuments. We want to preserve them as best we can because we feel like by preserving them and somehow protecting them from just the effects of time, that we can somehow get at a more authentic connection to their, to these objects' lives. I'm sympathetic to that for sure, but I also think it's important, as you said, to recognize that we intervene in objects all the time. You can take even as, as world famous an object as the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa by Da Vinci has been painted, repainted, revarnished over and over and over again. Most paintings that you see, old master paintings, have gone through conservation efforts. We have taken paint off and put paint back on. And so the idea that we can somehow escape the effects of time and just not intervene in objects. Intervention is so crucial to the way that art objects are preserved today. And so intervention is going to happen no matter what. And so it's just about determining what are the most effective kinds of intervention, and that can be put to positive political and social ends.
When you were describing these different typologies of iconoclasm, you used the word performative.
Yeah, so to see these acts as a kind of performance, I don't mean a sort of rehearsed theater or a play or something like that. That's not quite what I mean. But, in the case of ISIS of Palmyra, for example, they didn't simply set off some bombs and walk away. No, they recorded it and made amazing videos. Well, not amazing, but, like high quality videos with music and took really dynamic photographs. The idea was to show that this is a performance, that what they were doing was not just just destroying for the sake of destroying, but they wanted to create a kind of meaning and turn this iconoclastic act into a performance, and to make it meaningful through these performative aspects of it.
And what about if we look at an example like the Paris Commune, and how are these actions studied as objects?
Yeah, exactly. So jumping back into time now. Of course, the intervention and destruction iconoclasm is, of course, nothing new. It is not unique to the 20th and 21st century at all. And so what you're looking at here is a photograph of the Vendôme column in Paris, which during the Paris Commune, which was a short-lived worker-led political takeover of Paris after the Franco-Prussian War, where the French government had left Paris, and basically workers took over the city. And in the column here was a large column. It was a copy of Trajan's column, a famous Roman monument, with a statue of Napoleon on top. And as part of their takeover of the city, Napoleon, a famous, one of the greatest imperialists of the 19th century, and whose descendant, Napoleon III, was just captured in the war that preceded the Commune. They were trying to make Paris, to refigure the monuments of Paris to make them more, less imperial and more in service of the politics of the people. And interestingly, the man that called for the removal of this statue was none other than Gustave Courbet. And Gustave Courbet is one of the top 5 most famous painters of the 19th century. He was himself an artist, one of the great artists of the French 19th century tradition, and himself believed that there are certain art objects that need to be destroyed. So that, even artists and great artists who believe, it's precisely because they believe in the power of art, understand that there are certain artworks that, because they're meaningful, need to be retooled, effaced, or they can't exist as they have. And what was so amazing about the Commune, of course, is that through this whole process, the staging of bringing down this column, it was photographed at every single stage in a weird shadow of what ISIS would do at Palmyra as well. And these photographs, which are incredible, I'm just showing you one here, but I really encourage you to look at them all, have themselves now become art objects that art historians study. And from my perspective, the column itself and Napoleon's very generic statue on top is not a very interesting art object. I don't think there's a ton to say about it. But these photographs, on the other hand, these are fascinating. And you can study both the performance that these photographs capture and the photographs themselves as art objects. So again, is sort of thinking about how these acts of ostensible destruction have all these creative dynamics to them, is the performances themselves are very interesting for art historians, and the kinds of artworks that they produce in the process, photographs, videos, whatever else it might be, these are the things that are going to be very interesting to art historians 100 years from now. The photo, that incredible photo that we started with of Edward Colton's statue being thrown into the river in Bristol, is an incredible photograph, not just aesthetically, but also as of capturing a moment in this performance of taking the statue down. And so I think that's something that's also doesn't get thought about, is that these performance, from the art historical perspective, the ways in which these objects are removed, which are generally quite strategic and have aesthetic dimensions to them, are often more interesting to art historians than the monuments themselves.
If we look a little bit more about, this aspect of performance, social performance, we've been gathering these images from the media. So we're seeing here how these public spaces are turning into sites of gathering and expression. So here's an image of ballerinas dancing in front of the monuments. Then we have here people playing chess. We also have musical performances that are taking place. I'm wondering if we could discuss the idea of the ritual as this ideological arena in which symbolic images and gestures have a particularly persuasive impact on a participant's sense of identity and social reality. And what is the power that the ritual activity exercises?
Yeah, and again, it's like these are all relatively spontaneous gestures too. There's something that's so beautiful and human about these, unlike the calculated, strategic, almost bureaucratic ways in which the sculptures themselves come about. These gestures are far more spontaneous. And of course, they're part and parcel of this trying to reappropriate the meaning of these art objects. And this monument in particular is an equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. So for Black bodies to be here, performing, showing their beauty, not letting this object, which was once meant to intimidate Black people and keep them out of this space, for them to meaningfully inhabit it and to perform all, and to make the site into a new space for Black cultural expression, is itself is a defiance against the meaning of this art object, right? There are ways to recontextualize and reorient the meaning of these that don't necessarily require removing the statue or defacing the statue necessarily. It's just how the space that monument is meant to define can be redefined through new cultural expressions like these.
And there's the Belgian political theorist Chantal Mouffe. She talks about the public space as a place of confrontation, and she says that it's a place of dissensus where reconciliation is not possible. And she uses the word agonistic, and she calls it the agonistic struggle, where we engage directly with political reality. And she says that this is actually the core of a vibrant democracy. So my question is there a counter narrative that we're seeing emerging? Are power structures actually being reconfigured?
It's a great question. I mean, I don't want to be overly optimistic here about I feel like it's still too early in these processes to know exactly what the long-term effects are going to be, especially because, shifting out of the art historical and aesthetic sphere and just moving into the political very briefly is, there is a lot of resistance to these kinds of protests in the United States as well. So it's unclear yet, what the long-term effects of these kinds of these performances, these acts of iconoclasm will be. But what I will say, speaking about Chantal Mouffe's point, is I think that aspect, the agonistic idea that she inserts into this notion of the public, that the public is not necessarily the space where rational individuals come together and somehow reach consensus on how best to move forward, is a bit of a liberal myth. And looking at history, especially history of the West and history of democracies in particular, is the agonistic, the public as a site of strife and of contention and of destruction, has actually been essential to the history of democracies. And so I think it's important for everyone to understand that these kinds of moments are not aberrations in the normal operations of democracy. These are the normal operations of democracy, and artworks in particular, because artworks are the places where social values, whether of protected interest groups or of larger bodies, whatever it might be, artworks play the role of defining our values. And so it's natural that these objects are going to be the places of contestation where those agonistic moments play out. And so we should see this again as I don't want to overly naturalize it, but to not be so shocked by this, and to understand that these artworks are kind of doing what they're supposed to be doing here. And they're showing how meaningful artworks can still be. It's just going to be the question of what are we going to do with this space? What are we going to do with these objects when the values that they espouse are no longer the values that we have now? But that is going to be an agonistic process. It's not going to be smooth, and to come to terms with that.
If we consider the possibility of recontextualizing these monuments, is there a way to preserve their memory, but also a way to create a distance from the ideologies that they represent? What would you suggest be an alternative life for them, where their narrative may change, but the symbolic value could be retained?
I mean, so I think the obvious one that we should talk about is the idea that these objects should be moved to museums, which is not an idea that I'm opposed to outright, but that becomes a tricky issue. Museums are not neutral spaces. They are also the secular temples of value, right? They are spaces where we go to understand what is important and what is not important, what is great art and what is not great art. So just moving these into the museum is not necessarily going to change the value that have historically been inscribed on them. It's going to take more than that. If, for example, you're going to move a statue of Robert E. Lee into a museum, well, we need to understand a way of exhibiting it that's not just going to essentially reproduce the kinds of things that it did when it was out in the public. So the museum is an option, but it's going to require interesting curatorial approaches to not just, it's not just about moving them, it's about reinterpreting their meaning. So museums are an option. However, I think, you know, going through the bureaucratic process of getting these things moved is extremely frustrating. It's extremely, can be extremely ineffective, especially since before a lot of these actions were taking place, Black activists, Indigenous American activists were calling for the removal of these statues peacefully for many, many years, using scholarly sources and academics like me as witnesses, and nothing happened. And so my feeling is that if the museum is an option, but there's something that I really, really love about creative recontextualization. The quiet moving of these art objects, I think, somehow preserves these art objects. I don't want them to go peacefully, if you understand what I mean, especially the Confederate monuments, which are such technologies of racial violence. I want to see them be put to new ends and to be creatively reappropriated by artists. And we can, and as someone who's not an artist, I can only point to other examples, which I think we'll talk to in a moment, of other artists who have found ways to do it. But you can see just in the examples of the graffiti or of you know, the performances by ballerinas or musicians around them, that maybe taking these artworks and making them one element of a new kind of artwork can be a way of not just erasing the racial violence that these statues embody, but to you know, we're not erasing history, we're just going to sort of, in a way, correct history and use other artworks to do that.
When we think of the challenges of contemporary artworks in public spaces, just to shift a little bit the topic, I thought that we needed to start maybe by looking at the work by Richard Serra and questioning whether contemporary artworks in public space are still caught up in this archaic notion of the idea of permanence, where they need to be fixed. And here in 1981, you had Richard Serra, who was commissioned, and he made the site-specific piece called the Titled Ark that was placed in the Federal Plaza. And the work actually came under controversy, where a lot of people who were using that space felt that it was actually imposing and it obstructed movement, and they eventually that work came under such criticism that it was eventually moved into an indoor museum space. So here's an instance where an artist wanted to give the public a different kind of physical experience of a public sculpture, where they would physically experience the work, and also that experience would alter their experience of that space. But it was just completely rejected by the public and then forcibly removed.
Of course, when you have a bespoke public monument artwork like Titled Ark, is, you know, Richard Serra designs these specifically for the space. You know, I mean, his artworks are not, obviously they're not representational. What they're meant to do is to work with the lived environment. And so with an artwork like that, you can move it into a museum, but it's not the same artwork anymore. You know, it doesn't do the same thing because it's so contingent on the space that it was designed for. But what Richard Serra did in that case, though, is, you know, understood that the people that actually live and inhabit that space should have a say in what goes there. And it's interesting that, you know, in certain cases people will listen, and in other cases people will not.
There's the Dirty Corner, which was Anish Kapoor's installation at the Palais de Versailles, which was actually nicknamed the Queen's Vagina. That came under, the work was repeatedly targeted by instances of graffiti and vandalism, but many of these instances were actually anti-Semitic, so religiously intolerant messages that were, added to the work, so to speak. So in this case, would you say that these interventions are an extension of that sculpture?
Well, it's interesting that, like, these are such really abominable things that were written on this, and they weren't just written once. There was two separate acts of people coming to write these things. And Anish Kapoor, I believe one of his parents is Jewish, so this was very much targeted against him personally. But what is interesting is that after the second time that these were vandalized, what Anish Kapoor said into the press was that I want to keep these words as part of the sculpture. This is a quote, "These abominable words will become part of my work." I mean, what I appreciate about Anish Kapoor in this sense is that he understood that his own authorship, the own power that he has as the maker of this, is when you make public art, is you have to sort of cede some of the singular power that you have as the author to those that engage with it. And I think it was a very interesting moment, and one that I think we can learn from as we think about the monuments in the United States. The ways that people engage with them, these acts of defacement or whatever, these are now inseparable from the art object. This moment, this anti-Semitic attack on his work has become part of the history of this art object. And in a way to get rid of it, to erase it, is to erase that history. So I think he very cleverly and meaningfully decided to keep it. He recognized that it had become part of the meaning of the work, and he didn't want to hide that. Anti-Semitism is a real thing, and it was a real part of the life of this work. And so I think preserving it it could be a lesson as we think about other kinds of monuments, this opening up of the art object, of letting it have a life, of letting people engage with it.
When you talk about recontextualizing objects, allowing older objects to be preserved while also altering their meaning with newer interventions or newer actions in that space. This is the example of The Fearless Girl, another work that came under quite a lot of criticism, that was placed in front of the Charging Bull, which we know is an iconic public sculpture in Manhattan's financial district. And the bull actually represents the booming American economies, and that girl actually challenged it, challenged that with her hands on her hips in front of the bull, but also brought up and raised questions related to gender diversity in the financial district.
Whatever your feelings are about the politics of this, even a lot of feminists were not happy with this sculpture. They thought that it didn't quite do enough, but that's not really the point. What I do think Christian Bisball's work does, which is interesting, is this is an example of an artist using a pre-existing artwork as an element in a new artwork. And I think that could be a really one of the interesting ways to recontextualize these monuments. The one case that there's been enough time there's a version of this that happened in Bristol, where the plinth, that large pedestal that the statue of the slave owner Edward Colton once inhabited before protesters threw him in the river, an artist named Mark Quinn put up a statue of the local BLM activist Jen Reed with her fist in the air. It was a sort of large, I believe, bronze sculpture that went in that place. And so that was another sort of interesting moment where obviously the original sculpture wasn't there, but the plinth was. The fact that she's occupying the space that was once occupied by the image of a slave owner was of course part of the meaning of the work. So the ways that activists and local governments could think about commissioning artists to do this kind of process, to create new works of art that contain as elements these older ones, I think could be a really interesting way of not letting museums hide the violent histories of these monuments, but to actually draw attention to them. and to make these monuments into the monuments of the history of segregation, of the use of artworks to intimidate Black populations. I think that could be, that is, to me, a very appealing way of doing it. I'm not an artist again, so I'm not creative enough to come up with interesting possibilities, but I think Kristen Visbal's A Fearless Girl is one model to follow.
Okay, with regards to public or contemporary works commissioned for the public space, I'm wondering whether there may be a possibility to encourage a more osmotic or reciprocal relationship where the work could actually be affected by what is around the space that it is intervening or inhabiting, where it may be affected by external stimuli like the geography or economy or history of a space and the different publics that engage with it. Here's a work that we discussed to insert, which is by Francis Alice, Belgian artist that moved to Mexico City, I think in the 90s. And here's an example of an early work that he did. It's actually a video piece and a social performance called Cuentos Patrióticos in 1997, which is centered around the main square in Mexico City, which is called the Zocalos, which is actually quite a problematic square because it was laid out by the Spanish conquistadors as a sign of their victory over the Aztecs. And then later on throughout history, the site has become a space of public demonstration. So here in the video, basically, you have a man who's performing the function of a bellwether that is leading a flock of sheep around the main flag, around the main flagpole. And every time we hear a bell in the video, there are more sheep that join the bellwether and follow him. And the reference to the sheep, in fact, is from an actual event that took place in 1968, where which was a time of political unrest in Mexico City, and you had these public demonstrators that came out against the government and they started bleating like sheep. So here is an artwork that references specific moments of history, but also subverts it and inserts a bit of humor and contextualizes the meaning of that space altogether.
And I think, and there are other examples of this too. I mean, these kinds of monuments that are designed to not be sort of autonomous works of art that are that's just the object. I mean, you can think specifically perhaps about the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which is a kind of sculptural architectural monument that you're meant to walk through. And it's an artwork whose meaning is activated through movement of your body, the experience of being there, moving through it, etc. The idea of rethinking about monuments is, like you said, having this kind of, they're not so neatly framed. They are kind of have this openness to them, where the meaning isn't so neatly defined, but is intended to be activated through particular kinds of performances and the presence of particular kinds of people. I think when having to move to the larger conversation of what are we going to do with public space, do we just want to have more sculptures of better people, like people that we find more historically sympathetic? Or do we want to actually radically rethink the function of monuments, that they're not supposed to be just purely memorial of a single event or a single individual, but are meant to have this kind of adaptability, and are intended to bring in other elements that maybe the artist had never intended, and to let that become part of the life and meaning of that art object. To me, that seems very exciting.
Just to shift a little bit, and we were discussing that we're hearing and seeing the word erasure be floated around in the press. And I'm wondering whether the iconoclastic act is meant to initiate a ritual of forgetting, and whether it's actually ever really possible to erase monuments, people, ideologies from public memory.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it really gets to the heart of the conversation we've had so far, because I hope that through the different case studies that we've discussed is that these acts are not ones of erasing history, or are not meant to be acts of willful forgetting. quite the opposite. I mean, in many cases, these monuments are themselves historically, they distort history. They're the ones that are distorting and erasing aspects of history. And these interventions are largely to correct that. But I would also argue that I'm not exactly clear what people believe is being erased anyway. These monuments aren't, it's not like we get rid of monuments in Robert E. Lee and suddenly we're going to forget Robert E. Lee existed. Monuments are not necessarily great conveyors of obvious historical meaning. They're meant to express value, and that's meaningful. But even, you know, late 19th century, early 20th century, the first people who were thinking about monuments recognized that certain monuments don't necessarily need to be around forever. They don't actually carry that much interesting historical meaning. And so when you add this kind of deficiency of historical value to also their histories of actually functioning as technologies of racial violence, it's really hard, I think, to justify the continued existence of these monuments. And so erasure, I think, if it's a term that's going to stay in the discourse of this, really needs to be particularized and needs to have a clearer definition about what exactly is being erased.
We'll just open up now, Tad, to the audience questions that we've been receiving. Would you make a distinction between political statements like towering statues and objects of art?
It depends. I mean, I think those distinctions are only meaningful depending on the questions that you're asking. I mean, many of these monuments were designed by people who self-identified as artists. But of course, when you're designing artwork for public space, that's very different than making a painting for a private patron, right? So there are meaningful similarities, but there are also meaningful differences as well. When you're designing a monument or a sculpture for a public space, you're thinking about very different considerations than you would be if you were designing an artwork for a private buyer or for a non-public setting. So the maybe unsatisfying answer is yes and no, or it depends. But I still feel like you can talk about these artworks. These I would call them artworks. I still feel like an art historical lens and treating them as art objects is at least one viable way of talking about, these public statues.
You spoke of vandalism outdoors and in public spaces. Destruction of artworks happens inside museums as well sometimes, like with the works of Rothko vandalized at the Tate Modern. Rothko belonging in a museum is almost universally agreed upon for his technique and practice. How do we make room for dissent in the organized study of art and art history rather than overt opposition and defacement like this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, again, the probably unsatisfying answer is sometimes these need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. And making large generalities, it's very difficult to do because you can think of so many individual exceptions to the rule. In some of these instances where artworks have been defaced within the museum, some of them have been motivated by very strategic political and moral philosophical intentions. Others have been seemingly very personal and hard to understand within a larger historical and sort of social context. And I would look at each case. For each of their particularities. So, I don't recall all the particularities of this individual in the Rothko case off the top of my head. But I wouldn't make a hard and fast distinction between the kinds of vandalism or sort of iconoclasm that we see in the museum versus outside of the museum. The obvious point of distinction, however, is the role of public statues in defining public space. Public statues interact with their space in a way that, well, some of Rothko's works absolutely do as well, but very differently, right? Rothko's works are not trying to define the cultural value and historical meaning of the individual gallery space in which it's exhibited in, whereas a statue of Robert Lee Lease put outside of a courthouse very much is. And so I think that the publicness of these objects is very important. And the way in which they interact with the particular built environment and urban environments that they inhabit.
Culture is fluid in that we look at events through different lenses as time moves on. And as we move forward as a society, for example, an LGBTQ lens or a feminist lens from which we view history. How can we preserve monuments rather than destroying them, as they might at some point need to be part of the study of time? How do we separate the moral from the historical?
I mean, that's such a fantastic question. And that is part of my fear too, if we don't radically rethink the role of monuments generally, we're going to get trapped in this cycle, I think, of just elevating idols, tearing them down, elevating new ones, tearing them down. From an art historical perspective, it seems like that is inescapable, at least in some respect. That's just kind of, that sort of seems to be the order of things, that if there are going to be meaningful paradigm shifts, that this is going to occur. But I think what would help us, what we at least need to make the energy to explore, are other models of monuments that are inherently adaptive, that take into consideration that these changes are going to happen, that culture is fluid, and that the politics of today will not be the politics of the future. And so how do we incorporate an unknown future that we know will be different from our own? How can we make space for that in the monuments? How can we open these monuments up to that kind of that kind of morphing that will necessarily happen? That is a serious challenge, and I you know, there are many people who are proposing these things, not just scholars and artists, all kinds of people, and I hope that if there's one thing that will come out of this moment, is that it will be giving some urgency to those questions, understanding that 100 years from now, we're not going to feel the same way about the things that we feel like are super important now, and our monuments need to change with us, you know, and not anchor us to particular historical values.
Should monuments have a shelf life and expiration date when commissioned? If you're talking about the fluidity of meanings and changing of values.
It's hard, because then it's a question of who determines that shelf life. And it's interesting that some monuments seem to have much longer shelf lives than others. It's another case-by-case basis thing. You know, and I'm wary of who exactly is going to make those kinds of decisions. And of course, then when its shelf life expires, where does it go? Does it go into a dusty storehouse? Museums are already overcrowded, and they don't want to take these things if they're not going to generate any value for these museums. So do we leave them to just expire, to let the environment and nature take its course? I'm not sure. But there's clearly an issue with this. What we're recognizing now, and I think this question and the last question as well have really put their finger on, is that the inherent issue of monuments is when you memorialize something, is that we know that that memory is going to change, and how do we account for that, and how do we build monuments that are going to be attentive to that? It's a difficult issue, but the idea of a shelf life is difficult, because who's going to make that decision?
In our current culture of giving and taking offense and social media rating, how do we have conversations about the preservation of such monuments without looking at history as a binary? How important is understanding context?
Immensely, and like that's why it's a very unsatisfying answer to these questions whenever I say, oh, we got to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. But as a historian, that's really what I believe, is context is essential, so essential. You know, the fact that these Confederate monuments were generated by whites, like open white supremacists who were looking to use artworks for the goal of intimidating Black populations, is essential to their history. And the meaning of this exact same statue, if it were to be the exact same statue, but was made under different historical circumstances, that is to say, if it had a different context, then I would say that the meaning would be different, and maybe my feelings about it would change too. that's what I meant when I said that sometimes these monuments are really bad containers of historical meaning, because you can't get the whole picture from just looking at these things. And you really need to do the sort of art historical labor to understand the context of these monuments, and for us to make intelligent, rational decisions on a case-by-case basis for these monuments. Some deserve to be preserved. Some, I don't think they do. Others maybe are primed for recontextualization through new means, but I think it's impossible to make a determination on all of them. And I would caution, and I'm against the idea of anyone that puts forward a sort of all statues need to be destroyed, or all statues need to be kept in museums. That kind of dogmatic approach to me is not right.
How do you feel about destruction of artworks created from materials which today we would not consider acquiring? For example, elephant ivory. The skill and effort and time that would be represented through that piece of work is itself part of art education.
Absolutely. I guess I would, maybe I'm missing a piece of context here if there are animal rights activists who are claiming that these art objects need to be destroyed because they are, obviously the animal had to be killed in order to acquire them, and there's this violence behind them. But like from one of my great friends, a scholar who works on medieval ivories and the sub-Saharan trade from West Africa all the way to Europe, ivories became a very important medium in early Christian art and medieval art. These ivories and artworks are essential for us to understand these networks between Africa and Europe, which have their own particularly urgent meaning today, where there's so much discussion of immigration and the compatibility of Western European culture and cultures of non-Europe. So exactly, like I would bemoan not having these rare deposits of that history. Otherwise, we might not be able to understand those connections. So again, it's a case-by-case issue, but yeah, I'm not. I have no strong feelings that just because these are made from animal parts and required the killing of animals, that they should somehow just be chucked in with monuments that were designed specifically to segregate cities. I see those as separate. But I also would be terrified if a museum was actively collecting like ivories, like new ivory work. That would be not okay.
Okay, maybe one last question before you run off. Public art and statues, monuments, etc., are accessible, unlike objects within a museum that could be deemed highbrow or inaccessible. Could we as society come up with guidelines on what might work as public art, which isn't just butterflies, flowers, and sporting statues?
100%, 100%. And the issue, one of my first jobs ever was I worked as an assistant to a public art consultant, and dealing with local governments to put up artworks. And you can imagine what it's like to work with bureaucrats to come up with dynamic works of art. It's extremely difficult, because the people that are ultimately going to fund this and make the decisions behind it do not necessarily have dynamic political views, or are looking to make art that is going to do something radical. They're typically looking for the most innocuous things possible that are just pretty, like you said, flowers or what have you. But that is urgent. I really believe that we need not just a collective will, political will, but then we also need to build out our national art funds so that there is pools of money that are available to artists and their supporters to reinvigorate public space with new kinds of artworks. That is essential, but that's something that is going to take going to the ballot box to do, and we need to generate a lot of political will in order to do that. But I feel that work is urgent, 100%. And there are organizations out there that are, especially now in the United States, that are built off of the BLM movement. I will just plug Monuments Lab, which you can follow on Instagram, who are a Philadelphia-based organization who are specifically trying to radically reimagine what a monument is going to be in the 21st century and beyond. From scholarly perspectives, from artistic perspectives, they've come up with some really interesting ideas. And so as a start, I think that the wheels are in motion. It's just going to be about getting the government and the money together in order to make those dreams a reality.
All right, Tad, thank you so much for your time and for a very rich conversation and discussion and very insightful voice that that you brought here to Sunaparanta. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our audience for listening in, and stay tuned. Thank you.